Recording in progress.
Colleagues, if we could take our seats, please. Everyone grab a seat, please. We are sitting as a committee of the whole this evening of the City Council. We've invited the school committee and Dr. Nolan and Mr. Hurley to join us. We are being both audio and video taped. I'm very glad that we have a good turnout here in the chamber. We have a number of colleagues. Do I need to read off everyone who's online? All right. So I have Councilors Gentile, Greenberg, Humphrey, Kelly, and then school committee member Ozlewski on video. Everybody else is in the chamber. We're going to start obviously promptly at 7. We're going to finish no later than 9 this evening. We're going to have 2 presentations, one by Dr. Nolan, the other by Chair Bresky. I anticipate that those will be relatively short, and then we're going to open it up for questions from colleagues. I'll try to moderate those questions. Colleagues, I'm just going to ask you in advance, please try to keep these as questions rather than, statements or comments on what happened in the past couple of weeks or, strong support for the schools or whatever. Let's just try to be efficient with our time, respect our colleagues from the school committee who are here, and really direct questions at them so that they can provide us with a lot more information. So, Chair Bresky, are you going to go first? Or Dr. Nolan, whomever you prefer. Go ahead.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, President Laredo. So just to kind of give everyone a very quick overview on some of the financials of the contract that we just agreed to. The school budget is built on this base 3.5% growth in allocation year over year with an incremental 10 basis points, so a 3.6% allocation in for year 25, which is the September to 24 to June 25 school year. Dr. Nolan and I had extensive discussions with City Hall back in December, and the stabilization funds that we've all talked about for months and months, we came to an agreement. And part of why I think the school committee wasn't really jumping into that debate too much was stretching that out over 8 years to meet the time period from today to the time period when the expectation is the pension will be fully funded. Just didn't do what we needed it to do now. We have some real issues that we need to address now. We need to get high school class sizes down now. We need to get incremental supports in our elementary schools now. And so what we agreed to with the mayor was that we would spend those monies over approximately 5 years. So it's that $8.18 some million plus interest. And that was all designed to say, this won't fully fund us through that 2032 date when the pension is fully funded, but it will do the things we need to do now to have real impacts. It will leave us a funding gap, which I will talk about in a few minutes, but it leaves that funding gap at a level that we hope is addressable and far enough out into the future so that we can start planning for that today and start to solve that problem. And it's not going to be something where 4 or 5 years from now we're going to say, oh boy, we've got a big issue to address. In addition to that, the mayor has allocated an incremental $3 million of one-time funds to be added sort of into that bucket to be spread out over years. And that helped fund some of the the things that we negotiated during the period of the strike. On top of that, the other big thing that's worth noting is there are some assumptions that we will have to find efficiencies in the system, and this really falls to Dr. Nolan. I think it's not unreasonable to say that any organization that's been run by the same management team for a decade or more, a fresh set of eyes is likely to find some efficiencies. It's just going to take some time. They are not quantifiable as yet, but this gives you the order of magnitude of what's been contemplated as a base case scenario to make this sustainable in the interim.
I guess I would just also add, in addition to efficiencies, I think we are looking for revenue sources ourselves. And within the last 2 months, the grants office has indeed already brought in $1.5 million for literacy curriculum and other initiatives such as educator pipeline, teacher diversity issues and incentives. So there's a lot more that we could do in terms of our energy in addition to finding those efficiencies that we are seeking.
Thank you. And just to be clear, when you look at those numbers of $150,000, $300,000, all the way out to $4.5 million, those are cumulative. Those are not, it's not an incremental $1.5 million, an incremental $2 million. Those are cumulative over time.
Good.
Do you want to, yep. Next slide. So one thing I think we need to address, because I think there's been a lot of confusion about this number as it's been out in the media, is, and if you've seen it, there's this talk of this is going to cost us $53 million. I want to be very clear that that $53 million represents the increase in the contract cumulatively over the 4-year period. Obviously, looking at this, almost all of that really comes from the COLA increases. So if you wanted to think about this, this is really talking about COLA increases over a benchmark of 0, which was obviously never in the cards, was obviously never discussed or contemplated, but that's how our business and finance office put the numbers together. So they would build this up for each side, and that way, when we would talk about, well, there's a $60 million gap between us, this is where those numbers would come from, to say, what are all the union's proposals, what are the district's proposals, and how do they stack up relative to a baseline, for year 23, a last year's baseline with 0 growth. So all of this, almost all of this $53 million number was already baked into the pie. Most of it is there by virtue of just our assumption that we're going to get 3.5% growth year over year, but then as well, baking in the incremental monies, the overlay funds that we discussed with the mayor back in December. And so almost all of this was either in the budget or then was a negotiated compromise agreement over the last couple of weeks. So I just want everyone to be clear what those numbers represented. And if we look at those COLA numbers, just to go into a little detail and just make sure this is very clear. So the offers we had put in front of the NTA back on December 18th, and we were only contemplating a 3-year contract at that point in time, was a weighted average 2.5%, 2.5%, 3% over the 3 years of the contract. Those are the numbers that were agreed to, and then there was a 4th year of the contract added, which is 3.25% for the first half of that 4th year, and 4% for the second half of that year.
Chair Bresky, excuse me for a second. Vice President Kalis has a quick question.
Sorry, can I just clarify one thing, Chair Bresky? Thank you. On the previous page, the $53 million, that's not, is that incremental, or because I'm assuming there were COLA already within kind of what we were thinking, and so is that all incremental, or is that just $53 million the total?
That is, the $53 million is versus a 0% baseline COLA. So it's taking our last year's salary numbers and it's saying, what is the increase, assuming that was flatlined and there was 0 growth in that number.
So that's an inflated number versus what would have been reality.
Well, it's just, whether you want to say it's inflated or not, it's a number that represents relative to a world that would have never existed. Like I said, there's no contemplation that we would have ever said, oh, there's going to be a 0% COLA. But just for simplicity of the cost accounting, that's how it was built up. And that's how that number, because we were trying to be transparent, we were showing this is the aggregate cost of all our proposals, here's the aggregate cost of all the union's proposals, to show what those differences were. And so, you know, I think the media saw that $53 million number and sort of latched onto that without an understanding of what it really
I
represented.
see. Okay, thank you.
So in that $49 million of COLA, which makes up most of the 53, within that number is this 2.5%, 2.5%, 3%, which we had offered back in December. The only changes were with the fourth year, and then for Unit C, we averaged, which is our paraprofessionals, our aides, we added in an incremental fixed dollar amount on the third and fourth year of the contract, as opposed to adding an incremental percentage amount. And the reason we did that is we're extraordinarily competitive at the top end of the range for Unit C. We are less competitive at the entry level, and so adding a fixed dollar would be a larger percentage increase for those at the lower end of the pay scale and a smaller percentage increase for those at the higher end of the pay scale. So that's all that mechanism does, and that was a sort of creative strategic choice we came up with. But this is really meant to highlight that within that $53 million, that was mostly all baked into the pie back in the offer we put forth on December 18th. So this is, to Councilor Kalis's question, this shows you how that actually accumulates through the years. So relative to 2023 for units A, B, and E, next year, a 2.5% COLA represents a $3.7 million increase. The following year, it represents a $7.4 million increase, a 12.1. So that all accumulates between the totals of Unit A, B, E, and the totals of Unit C and D to that $49 million number. There's some rounding differences here because we started with just very round numbers, but that shows you it's the year-over-year accumulated impact relative to year 23. And if you could go to the next slide. If there's anything that I want everyone to take away from this is the most critical piece of information. So this chart shows the budget with our base allocation, which again is assumed at 3.5% going forward, with 3.6% in for year 25. We have agreed with City Hall to these overlay funds representing approximately $4-ish million a year, spread over 5 years, with then the incremental funding of that $3 million of one-time funds spread on top of that. And that will make us sustainable over the life of this contract and into the next contract. We will face a funding gap, however, for approximately 2 to 3 years between when those funds run out and the year 2032, when our pension becomes fully funded, and then we have a meaningful drop in what the city is funding to retirement liabilities by way of moving from pension to OPEB. And you know, that's the day when things get much easier for everybody in this room when it comes to municipal budgeting. We need to address that gap. And I want to be very clear to everyone right now that this is a reality we will have to deal with. And I don't want that reality to be, we can't meet the needs of students. So we are going to have to find a way to fund that gap. We need to start working on that now. And just to simplify this greatly, this is why we're having this discussion. The growth of our student needs is exceeding the growth of city revenues, and you can't say it any more simply than that. What kids require today is just different than 20 years ago, than 10 years ago, than even 5 years ago. That is the reality. I see it in my kids, I see it in my friends, I see it when I talk to teachers. Dr. Nolan lives it every day. let's be realistic and recognize part of the reason for that is our kids weren't in school for the better part of a year. And that had a really destructive force on how they developed. And if you talk to Dr. Turner or Principal Strauss, you will hear that high school kids are exhibiting behaviors of 7th and 8th graders. And if you talk to middle school principals, middle schoolers are exhibiting behaviors of, 5th graders and 4th graders. That's the reality we're living in. So I just want to be absolutely clear. This is the dynamic we're dealing with. This is part of the equation of how we have to think about funding that gap. And I urge us all to start addressing that, and let's come up with a solution so that we aren't in a crisis 4 or 5 years from now. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Nolan, who will probably say something much more positive and optimistic than me.
Thank you, Chair Bresky. Dr. Nolan?
Want me to continue? I would also say, just to add to what Chair Bresky just said, that more and more has become expected of schools within the last 20 years as well. So schools are the front line for mental health services, medical services, screenings, parent communication, language translation services. So there's just been an increasing amount of complexity that has come to public schools. And Newton is not exempt from that. And certainly the complexity is amplified by our experiences in the pandemic and other experiences for the city. I am those new eyes coming in and spent several months doing a formal entry planning process. I met with about 59 groups of citizens across the summer. So that was my barbecue tour, if you will, of the city. And I also met with 400 staff people through open office hours and certainly watched classes, interviewed different groups, talked to students, and the entry planning never ends, really. I'm always on the lookout to understand the Newton School experience more deeply. I shared with all of you my entry plan. My public entry planning process was presented in November to the school committee. These were the major areas that I found the need to highlight some areas for us to take a look at and for us to think about funding and attention over time. So that was in terms of teaching and learning and what the quality of our curriculum, assessments, unit plans, and vertical alignment across the system. So very much moving from a system of schools to a school system in terms of how we are educating students and aligning our curriculum. Second area of attention was to address the impact of prior cuts on the high school class sizes, which are quite large. In almost all math and science classes this year, class sizes are 27 to 32 students at both high schools. When I first came on the scene in the spring of last year, there was a lot of discussion about student scores and AP scores, and they are directly correlated to the experiences of students that I have seen in the high schools. So in terms of those large class sizes, if there are 32 students in your class and you have a 50-minute class period, how much personalized attention do you think students are receiving in those classrooms? In some of our lab classes, it's almost impossible to execute the lab with that many young people in one class. In addition, students often have open parts of their schedule because there are no electives available due to budget cuts for that slot to be filled. I want those things for your young people. I want those electives restored. I want the things that other school systems in Metro West have, like early college and online electives, arts classes, and internship options that should be available to young people. So that was the second part. So for all the talk of conflict relative to alignment with our teachers union, quite in alignment for those needs, and was saying that in November, and really championed the same viewpoints that has been brought to us by our teaching corps. Third, I would say that we must work to build data systems and data literacy so that we can provide personalized learning for all of our young people. Newton parents need us to build trust with them of how are their children doing on that continuum of learning and skill acquisition, and we should be able to give real-time information about student progress over time. And we don't have the tools currently in place across all subject areas and within the system. So for example, we do a very good job right now of tracking K-8 literacy acquisition. I guess in the last 2 years, those types of assessments have been put into place. We need to scope that out to all of our learning areas, and we've been working on that this year, building off of what teams in the system have begun in prior years. Next, I would say workplace culture, systems, and planning. So human resources and business office long-range strategies have been a focus. So developing those staff recruitment, planning, retention, budgeting, so that folks like you know what we're up to, who we're recruiting, what it's going to cost, and what we think in a long-range plan will be necessary to scale the excellence that we want to see for the school system. We have a new HR director, and the HR director, Liam, our CFO, and his team, we've really been trying to get our groove going so that you can have the kind of long-range vision, so that you can speak to it and people can understand what our funding needs are, so that when we get to those time periods where we have to address funding deficits, you know what we're after. We're not just after no cuts, we're after a vision for students that means something to folks and that families want for their young people. And to me, that's what I want out of my kids' schools, and I know that's what Newton families have shared with me on my barbecue tour of the city. And finally, that speaks to the last piece that I heard very clearly post-pandemic in the city, that families and community members want more engagement and transparency from the school system. What are our practices and procedures? What is the curriculum? Who can we talk to get answers? Who knows my child? How do I know that you know my child and their needs? And so that is a many-pronged endeavor, from the communication office to the curriculum office to the business office and to the superintendent being able to speak to and tailor involvement with different constituencies in the city. So I had some pretty important meetings with the senior center this summer where people said, really, we need to know more about what's going on with the school budget. Will you come and give us education sessions about that? And absolutely, I will. And in doing so, just sort of building greater understanding for the needs of the school system. Also, just want to say, I understand that we live within an ecosystem, a financial one within the city, and it is also part of my role to understand what those competing forces are in other departments, so that we can find those synergies within the city that make sense, we can work together, and that there's confidence all around that we're not just the big old hog of the city budget as the school system, but that there's actual meaning to what's going into the funding of the system and our priorities. I share this core values slide. It was something that the school committee asked me to do in my interview, was to talk about why I would be a good fit for the school system, and just trying to give you an understanding of the orientation that I have towards student achievement and what happens within the system. So you're going to hear a lot about personalized learning and being a pioneer in terms of innovation and outcomes, and always acting with care for the community in a way to build collaboration and trust. Oh, that looks weird. What happened to all the slides there? Okay, well, that's what that's supposed to look like. So these are key findings from the entry plan, which I just gave you a high-level overview. You can enjoy this slide at your leisure, but the pieces that I've set out in November are the pieces that I'm grateful to the mayor and to her colleagues in City Hall Finance for helping us to achieve and already get in motion some of the activities that are necessary to meet the goals of my entry plan. Elementary staff need the capacity to have more planning time, and students need intervention supports within the school day. We can't subcontract out our student intervention needs to tutors, to private math schools, and to special education services. There's more to serving students than getting them qualified for special education. That's one way, but it's not the only way. And student interventions can be put into place in an aligned and meaningful way that may actually save resources for the district. We have to put that in motion by studying our elementary school day and working to create those systems. So that's in motion here and is part of some of those side letters you heard about from our recently negotiated union contracts to study the elementary school day. We will also do the same to address high school class sizes. So while we put in funding and staffing through the overlay surplus monies to address math and science class sizes, we must look at all the classes at all of the high schools to determine the best next steps to add those programs that I talked about previously and to address the needs of partially filled student schedules, which is a major concern of both students and families within the system. So too, I have to say that maximizing our career vocational technical education partnerships within the city and also expanding and restoring our arts opportunities is deeply important to the community, and they have suffered in the budget cuts of recent years. We are working on some of these areas, and the check marks show things that are already happening or on their way to completion. I would also say to you that with the free cash monies that you supported in a recent vote for a curriculum, we will be able to, over the long haul, increase the types of base curriculum resource materials to other parts of the school system. Currently, base curriculum resources exist in math and English language arts at the elementary school mostly. There are a handful of textbooks and curricular resources available throughout the rest of the district, which makes us ripe for an uneven deployment of curriculum. Teachers have wide latitude, and they should. That's the joy of teaching, that teacher's secret sauce. But we need to provide them some base resources upon which to build the personalized structures to meet the needs of the kids sitting in front of them. It's very tall order to be a teacher in Newton if you are not given those resources, and you must be a curriculum designer, an assessment designer. You also have to know the needs of the children in your class and adapt instruction and all of those materials to that young person. We do need to get high quality materials in the hands of our teachers. So thank you for supporting that and for giving us that check mark right out of the gate. Other key findings we talked about are creating human resources systems and business office systems, looking at things like position control so that individuals like you can have confidence in our budgeting and that there's not explosions of positions that are filled or unfilled, and that you can follow the ball within our budget, so to speak. So we are working on those systems. Also, just building the public trust on our spending plans, and to that end, Liam here is submitting our budget to the national MASBO meritorious budget system to have a national organization of business officers look at our budget and give us feedback on how we're doing with an eye towards receiving that designation within 3 years. So we're looking forward to all that. I have high hopes, Liam, high hopes. And then, of course, upgrading our communication and transparency with families. We're about to move to a different multilingual, multi-resource parent communication platform. Has a social media-like interface, so it's like Facebook. People subscribe to it in their home language, and it makes it very easy for anyone to communicate with families across the system. In a subsequent year, it may replace classroom phone services, which could be a savings for us in the future. Many of our classrooms don't have phones, and it makes it very hard for teachers to find the time and space to actually pick up the phone and call families. So lots of exciting things happening in terms of parent communication in the future. We have created a data dashboard and a curriculum transparency site. They are launching in phases. The K-8 curriculum site is live now. The data dashboards are available to teachers and to administrators at this time, with the eventual eye that parents will be able to see those dashboards as well. So if you have a question about how your child's doing, you would log into the system and you would see your child's performance over time so that you could ask good questions as a family member and collaborate with your educators in really meaningful ways. We have worked to expand and refine the Office of DEI to include anti-ableism work and disability awareness education. The Office of Student Services has a disability advisory group with folks with lived disability experience giving us advice on the next generation way to educate all of our students about being the most inclusive environment that we can. We have a new curriculum that will be deployed K-5, which looks at how people, it's a thematic curriculum that looks at how people play, how people learn, how people listen, how people understand, which is a very broad way to help all types of students be accepted and understood within our classrooms. And of course, we're focusing on our curriculum alignment, as I mentioned earlier. Finally, we did contract with Boston College's InTask research group to study how is technology actually being used as a learning tool within the Newton Public Schools. That study and its design, we are just waiting. We have to get teacher survey responses to this, which we could not get in the work to rule environment that we were previously in. But this study will allow us to understand both the techniques and experiences that students are having with technology in the schools. It also creates an entree for us into a worldwide database that this particular user group has created to cross-reference the use of technology, teacher morale, and student well-being within the system. So we're really looking to be a part of some groundbreaking research that, for example, in some of the early research of this group, they found that teachers who use technology for collaborative purposes a certain percentage of the time tend to be happier and have happier students. So we're looking to see, like, what are those trends we can hear about students in the Newton schools, and what does that mean then for our long-range planning of pedagogy and the role that technology will have in it, and long-range planning for sustainability of devices and things like that. So getting a long-range plan for the district, because one does not exist for those technology pieces that were added to the system during the pandemic. So we have to decide, do we want the same type of learning environment in the next 5 years or 7 years? So in November, I said that our next steps were to settle contract negotiations, continue with our profile of a graduate sessions, do a strategic plan session, do some budget education and transparency workshops, and have visits with our government partners. So check on the contract negotiations, check on the budget education transparency workshop, of which this is number one. And then I invite you all, of course, to some government partner school visits, which my assistant is putting together as we speak, and you'll be receiving an email if you haven't already today. So I hope that you'll join us for those visits so that you can see in action all of the excellence and the needs of the Newton Public Schools and have some real informal time with us to visit those environments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Nolan, for that really excellent presentation. I think I can say on behalf of all of us that we're feeling very optimistic about the direction that you're heading in. So with that, colleagues, time for questions. Councilor Grossman, I want you to lead it off.
Thank you. I have a number of them, so cut me off if you want to move on to other people after I get started. The first thing, I know you said no speeches. I won't make it a speech. I just have to say thank you to the people sitting in front of me in the middle of this room. What you went through these last several weeks, I can't even imagine the intensity and the hours and the stress and the emotion. And I just want you to know how personally grateful I feel. I think that's a common sentiment, but I can't go one step further without telling you how much your work and dedication and passion means to me. If you could put the gap slide back up. So the slide was pretty clear, 4 to 5 years. So the first question I had is, can we just be really specific about what we're talking about? So that looks like fiscal 29?
Yeah, so the overlay funds and the incremental funds that were allocated, which again, were sort of to fill out that last year, that fourth year of the contract, that takes us into for year 29. At which point we expect we will deplete those funds and face a small funding gap in that year, which will then become a sort of full funding gap for year 30, for year 31, and then the presumption is in for year 32, when that glorious day comes when the pension is fully funded and there's a little relief to our budgetary constraints, that we would at that point be able to deploy some of those funds to get back to that level service. So it's really sort of a 2+ year gap we're looking at.
The glory year is really FY '33 because FY '32 is still short, just to.
So is it possible to be more specific about the expected size of that gap in these different periods of time?
Yeah, so I mean, it's, it depends a little bit on what your assumption about the level service rate of growth is going to be. We have seen that in recent years, it is significantly above that 3.5% level. If we assume that will still be the case going forward, then, we would be looking at a gap that could be, in the high single-digit millions of dollars a year, which would equate to, at that future point in time, roughly 2.5% of our budget.
Okay, so high single digit, to me, that means like 8-9 million a year.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, uncertainty as the cone expands in those years, because it's not just a function of, well, what is level services in those future years? It's a function as well of, exactly how these funds are going to be depleted. Is it going to, how far into that for year 29 do we get before the funds are depleted? There's a lot of moving parts. So I don't want to be unnecessarily precise when there's no ability to be precise. I will try to be accurate and say, yeah, if you're talking in that like $7 to $9 million range, I think you're being very reasonable.
Okay, and the reason that I'm trying to,
Can I just add on just quickly?
sure.
We intentionally, just as the schools do a long-range forecast, so does the city. So there's a ton of variables to think through. Obviously, the forecast for a year or 2 or 3 years out is a lot more accurate usually than when you're looking at 5 or 6 or 7 years out. That said, I completely agree with the analysis that if we're looking 5, 6, 7 years out, we either have to grow our revenues or moderate the growth in our expenses to make the lines work.
Okay, and the reason that I'm asking is with the problem-solving framework of, we know we have this problem coming, what steps are there? What's the pool of possibilities that we might consider? And I don't expect that we're gonna solve that sitting here in this large group tonight, but that's sort of where my mind is at, kind of coupled with the reality that you're also assuming sort of, you said level student need, right? I guess my feeling in a large part of this process, we kept hearing this term, full funding of the schools. And I kept saying to folks, well, what does that mean to you? Because full funding of the schools to me is a number far north than anything any of us could have conceived of in this negotiation process, because in addition to the deep need we know we have right now, in part, well, I mean, certainly the COVID-19 factor, there's all kinds of other things that I think we would love to be offering our students in areas of growth and development and excellence and improvement that aren't even anywhere in that line or this chart. So in addition to filling that gap, my mind is going, how are we going to get there? Because I think we're hearing from our families and our teachers and our leaders that we have to be thinking about how we're going to do that. am not suggesting that I have an answer to offer, just where my mind is going. A couple other assumption questions. The OPEB piece, are we assuming that the OPEB plan that we've sort of always talked about as the plan, once we get through full funding of the pension, remains in its current form? Or are we assuming that as the world changes and the healthcare landscape changes, maybe we're not putting in the same dollars that our initial long-range expectation about OPEB funding suggests?
To translate this into English,
Sorry.
we offer all our employees two different types of benefits. One is a pension. Many of the teachers are in their separate pension funding system through the state, but a whole bunch of other school employees are in, we'll call it the city pension. All employees, whether city or school employees, get other post-employment benefits, OPEB, but really you could call it retiree health care is the term that most people, it would resonate with them. That's all our school employees as well as our city employees. And yes, people have to work a certain number of years and before one vests. It's a much, much, much bigger liability than our current pension liability. It's hundreds of millions of dollars, and we have not been appropriately funding it for a long, long time. We will every year revisit how to deal with our retiree liabilities. Currently, the plan seems to still make a lot of sense. Fully fund our pensions by the end of FY32, and then turn to the larger retiree health insurance benefits and take another 15 years after that to fully fund those. But there's a lovely possibility that once we fully fund pensions, that the cost that we will need for the retiree health care the following year in FY33 is significantly lower than the FY32 pension funding. So it still makes a lot of sense that come FY33, there will be additional funds available for ongoing operational needs in our schools and in our city departments.
Okay.
Can
Next
I just
question.
answer one more part of that? So yeah, just to talk specific on the numbers to answer your question. When I put pen to paper and look at forecasting out into those out years, my base case assumption, the city has said they plan to fund $50 million into the OPEB trust after pension is fully funded. So growing our rate of growth at pension funding, which is in the 40s millions of dollars now, will be in excess of $70 million in for year 32 when we hit that final year of full funding. So you're looking at an over $20 million operating windfall for the city, assuming that is the plan that is followed. That is the base case that I have built into my numbers here.
Okay. The one-time funds that made the fourth year possible, the $3 to $4 million, have we identified the source of those funds at this point?
Let me just be a little bit clearer about that. And we docketed with the city council. It's in your city clerk's office, but you wouldn't have seen it yet. Overlay surplus funds, we promised 70% of them plus the associated interest income to the Newton Public Schools, and worked carefully with the superintendent and the chair to make sure that they were comfortable. They wanted to use it over 5 years, and that the superintendent in particular felt comfortable that she could identify ways to either increase revenue or find efficiencies so there'd be no fiscal cliff. So one thing that was docketed with all of you today is an NPS Educational Stabilization Fund that all of you will have to vote on, the city councilors in the room. The 18.2 million of the overlay surplus, plus there's $800,000 of interest earned this year. That will come out of free cash. In addition, the only other dollars that were identified, some of it just before the strike, some of it during the strike, are $3 million of additional funding. The overlay surplus was identified, actually, for my part, in August. It was just a question of how to use it and over what time period. But that had been in the works for many months. The $3 million in free cash is also, I docketed it today, so that will be in front of you. Our intention is to support the Newton Public Schools and the superintendent by having that also go into the NPS Educational Stabilization Fund. And the city councilors annually, presumably, will decide. It's a majority vote to take money out of it. It's clear from both the superintendent and the chair of the school committee their intention about how many years to use it over and how much in any given year that currently they are thinking of, but that will come before all of you annually to decide.
Thank you, Mayor Fuller. Councilor Gross, I'm going to ask you to hold any more questions for the moment. And we'll obviously have ample time to discuss and debate the administration's newest proposal about the stabilization fund. I'm sure we'll be discussing that in quite some detail. Councilor Kalis.
I'm going to pass. Councilor Grossman covered it.
All right. Councilor Gentile, who's online. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to just come back for a moment to the discussion earlier on class sizes, and in particular, math and science at our two high schools. And I believe that, and this isn't the first time that we heard this, but that class sizes are in the range of 27 to 32 students in math and science at the two high schools. And I was wondering how that compares to previous years, maybe as recently as the prior school year, or maybe even 3 years earlier. And ideally, what would we want to see for, class sizes in those two subject areas at the high schools?
Do you want to? So
I do have an analysis on this that I can bring you over the last 10 years of class sizes. If you want to see that, I just need a few minutes to find it. And ideal class sizes, in my mind, would be below 25 for those two sections. And that has been a number that has held across other parts of the school system, but in this budget cut time has been allowed. Not all classes have exactly the same needs. So for example, there tend to be larger music ensemble classes or phys ed classes, things of that nature. So one of the negotiated side items for our contract this year is a side letter asking us to have a committee to look at what is the ideal program for the high schools right now, given the needs of students and class sizes and our available resources.
Again, though, I'm trying to focus on the comments that have been made about math and science. I know some other course classes are obviously larger, but I think you said 25 just in general, which I assume you're saying that ideally math and science would be similar to other major subjects. And so I guess what you're saying is that what you would want to see are math and science classes that are 25 or lower, if I understood correctly, which I think sounds very reasonable to me. What I'm just trying to understand is when and how did they grow to 27 to 32? I remember last year, there was a lot of discussion towards the end of the budget process about certain needs in the school system. It was mostly, if memory serves me right, about, kindergarten aides, classroom instructional aides. But I don't remember anybody saying to me that with this school budget, you're going to see class sizes of 27 or 32 in math and science. So I'm trying to understand how we got there and why that wasn't made clear. And this really isn't for you, Superintendent, because you weren't here. And so I'm just wondering if somebody on the school committee could help me, because I don't remember anybody talking about that. We talked about other things and other needs. We talked about $600,000 for some aides, but I don't remember hearing about what I was very surprised to hear how big these math and science classes have become in the two high schools.
So let's, Councilor Gentile, thank you for that question. Let's, either Dr. Nolan or Chair Bresky, if you want to try to take a shot at that. And if you can't give the data on the spot, then try to provide it to us after the meeting.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sure. So just some context. As we talked about the budget cuts over the last couple years, there was specific discussion about them falling disproportionately towards high school because, as Dr. Nolan likes to point out, you can't just cancel fourth grade at Zervis. That's not an option. So as you're looking to, you're in that realm where you say, well, look, there's nothing else to cut but people, and that's, a spot no one wants to be in. But when that becomes the reality, typically that is going to fall disproportionately to high school because it's just more diffuse. And it means that you might be cutting electives and, you might have to just consolidate, the number of kids in a classroom. And it's fallen acutely towards math and science in part, and particularly at the honors level where those classes are oversubscribed, where, we can't even necessarily offer all the sections we want to be able to offer. That's been the reality of how that's played out. So when you look at, and I know this has been a point of discussion, when you look at over the last 5 years, and our enrollment has declined approximately 8%, and the number of classroom teachers has fallen approximately 4%. That's a function of, hey, look, you lose a couple kids in a elementary classroom, again, you still have 2 or 3 sections of that classroom. It doesn't scale linearly. When you get to high school, it does scale a little more linearly, and when you have to make those cuts, and you can't do it at the primary level, it just falls to high school. It is what it is. So our high school classroom teachers have fallen, but enrollment has stayed constant. That is going to equate to higher class sizes.
I would also add, Mr. Gentile, and here's just an analysis of the time period. When you cut electives, electives are usually taught by, like if I'm a math teacher, I might teach a computer science elective as a second, or if I'm a science teacher, I might teach a different science elective. It wasn't full FTEs that have been eliminated, but partial FTEs across many different departments, which have sort of death by 1,000 cuts, if you will. So this is an analysis, which I'm happy to send you, since 2015, showing the increase of the number of classes, the percent of classes where, in order to address the cuts, larger class sizes were enacted over time. Can I zoom in? Yes. Sorry, it's so tiny. I'm happy to make that public, but this is the...
Maybe you could, Dr. Nolan, maybe after the session,
Sure.
you could just circulate that to the council. I think that'd be helpful.
So they're with fewer buckets, if you will, of places to put children in the schedule. Larger bubbles crop up for required classes, and there are fewer choices within a 7-period schedule for students to have what they need. So the system over time offered fewer electives, then cut FTEs by 0.1 or 0.2, right? So you'd have a 0.8 science teacher who can no longer offer as many sections, and you just get bigger sections and less flexibility.
Counselor, thank you. Dr. Nolan, do you want to add anything, or are you all set? Counselor Gentile, does that answer your question for the moment?
Yeah, well, just one follow-up on that subject is, I believe that you're going to be seeing a decline in students at the high school level. Is that true? When does that occur? I mean, how significant is it?
So the school committee just received its report from McKibben, updating its long-term enrollment projections, and had a preliminary enrollment projection presentation at our most recent school committee meeting. So there will be a reduction within a 5-year period of time. I'm seeing that correct. I can't read that. That's too small.
So
5 years.
yeah, based on current levels of middle school enrollment, and this is not the official analysis. This was some numbers I had put together. We could start seeing declines in high school enrollment starting in the next several years. Yes, and the order of magnitude. I'll hold over in a second. The order of magnitude, we're talking a sort of 1-2% type decline over a period of couple years.
All right, thank you.
I
Go
just
ahead,
want to
School
chime
Committee
in.
Member Davenport. Go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to chime in to add that particularly in the math and science classes at the secondary level, decreased enrollment overall doesn't necessarily mean decreased enrollment in those courses, particularly for upperclassmen students who will often double up both in math and in science. Even when enrollment at the high school level goes down, typically math and science enrollment stays stable or goes up. So it's not a linear effect in that way.
All right. Thank you. Counselor Gentile, set for the moment?
Yes, thanks.
Great, thank you. Counselor Albright.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to just ditto Councilor Grossman's and the whole council's thank you for everything that you endured over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I guess it is, ago now. And the great presentation tonight. So my first question was for the mayor, and it had to do with the 3 million, but I think I understand now that the 3 million, the additional 3 million is going to come out of this year's free cash. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. I wanted to ask about the allocation, which is 3.5%. And obviously, over the 5 years where you get the bounce of the 4 million, a little bit plus, if you factored that into the allocation, do you know what it would be? Would it be like 3.8? What would the allocation be if you factored that into it?
So let me answer 2 ways, and Liam may or Maureen may want to chime in. First of all, if the economy is better, if there is more new growth, in particular, as everybody understands, Prop 2.5 limits the increase in our tax levy by 2.5%, so that we are highly dependent on what type of new growth, that's development and redevelopment in the city, is the boost above that. We do not believe that, for example, state aid will be much in excess of 2.5%. In fact, we think it's smaller. Everybody heard that our biggest state grant is for the schools. It's called Chapter 70. It only went up 1.8% for this coming fiscal year 25. We are very confident that we can count on new growth being 1%. So 2.5% from Prop 2.5 plus another 1% is 3.5%. We would love it if it's actually on a sustainable basis, large enough to allow us to increase all our budgets, whether it's the school allocation or city allocation, with the peculiarity that there are certain parts of the budget that grow faster that we just have to use our new growth for. We are very confident that we can say to Newton Public Schools, when you sign a contract, you can be very confident that the allocation will be 3.5%. Anything above that is very risky. For next year, we actually have said that it can be 3.6% increase in the funding for the Newton Public Schools. After that, it's 3.5%. The additional funds from the overlay surplus allow the budget to grow for MPS next year by a little over 5%. But then it's a step up, but then it will grow again at 3.5%, even including the overlay surplus, because we're having the overlay surplus grow at 3.5%. So it's a big step up, but stays steady at 3.5% after this year. Does that help explain it? And Liam or Maureen can certainly try different words and explain it better than me, I suspect.
That's helpful, but what I'm trying to be is a little bit aspirational as opposed to stuck in the here and now. If it takes more money to run we have a good school system. If it takes more money to run a great, fantastic, maybe we have that too, I don't know. If it takes more money, how do we get that more money? And if it means the council has to help with new growth and to act faster, if it needs the planning department to act in different ways, if it needs the city to act in different ways to get new growth, maybe we have to be more aspirational about raising that level to give more money to the schools. So it's not just on the schools to think about being, where can I cut, where can I get efficiencies, but how can we as a city do more and get more? Maybe we should think a little bit more about that.
I'll give you my answer, which is that the city council just wrestled heavily for the last few years with how to think about zoning, particularly around village centers, which are largely where we do have some manufacturing areas or office parks that are not in village centers. And I think we have come to a compromise that a lot of people feel is the right one for the city of Newton for right now. So I really believe that if we're looking for ways to increase funding for the Newton Public Schools, the superintendent is on the right track with it, making it clear how important education is to us as a community, how much our students in our Newton Public Schools are the heart and center, and that it will require us to look carefully and thoughtfully and seriously at our willingness to increase our taxes to pay for what we believe in and what our core values to our community, while simultaneously looking at spending every taxpayer dollar carefully, whether it's within the schools or on the city side. I do believe we will look at new growth, but we will do it what is correct for our community, and we will tighten our belt where we should and could and want to, and think seriously in the years ahead about overrides as well.
Yeah, I have no idea if it's possible
so-
to educate our electorate, but
I'm sorry, Counselor Albright, do you have another question?
I
then?
do. I
Go
do.
ahead, please. And let's try to, if we could, folks, I know the financial piece is critically important, but I think we also really want to focus on some of the educational pieces, because that's frankly an area that I think we have less familiarity with. I think most of us in this room are quite familiar with the finances. We spend a lot of time on them. So go ahead, Counselor Albright.
is there anything that we're able to do for the kids in high school this year? the money that you've got?
Not for this year, so we're budgeted for these funds for the subsequent year. The best thing that we can do is, I wanted to have this public discussion of how we were told all of these funds would be executed, because it really does rest in your hands at this point of whether our stated agreement becomes the actual agreement. We need to be able to start hiring as soon as possible for those positions. The earlier we're out on the scene, the better quality people we're going to get. And so the longer it takes to sort of book this plan, the longer we'll be chasing those staff members. We'd like to open fully hired soon in the fall.
Okay, thank you. And my last is a request. So when I was on the school committee, we met on the second and fourth Mondays, and the council met on the first and third, and now we meet on the same nights. And I'm going to put it before you as a school committee. Is there any way that you could go back to the second and fourth in next year, perhaps, so that we could come to your meetings and you can come to ours? That's just a request for the future. Thank you.
Well,
I think we ought to let the school committee, Counselor Albright, take that under advisement. That was my memory as well. When I served in the school committee, I personally found it, like you did, useful when there's a need for one body to appear before the other. But unless, Chair Bresky, you have an immediate answer to that, I think we can ask you to look at that.
no, I was going to tell Counselor Albright maybe she should move, you guys should move your meetings, but I didn't.
Chair Bresky, you're in the chamber tonight. You're our guest.
I didn't think that would be a productive comment.
All right, I'll set Counselor Albright for the moment. Thank you. Counselor Lucas, please.
Thank you, President Laredo. And welcome to the school committee, Mayor Fuller and Dr. Nolan, to the council chambers. I was looking at the earlier slides you had, and I was just wondering if you could just go back to the slide which showed units C and D, A, B, and E, and the COLA increase. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, and more importantly, I'm on the same page.
Were you referring to the slide with the percentages or with the dollar amounts?
The one percentages.
Okay.
Yep.
There you go.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So for FY26, FY27 for unit C and D, you have plus 500. Is that a $500 bonus, or is it an increase, nominal increase?
Yes.
What is that?
Yes, so a Unit C member, so I'll talk about for year 26, the third year of the contract. A Unit C member would receive the same 3 percentage point increase in COLA that a Unit A, B, or E member would, but then you will also receive an incremental $500 fixed COLA on top of that. So, and again, the mechanism there was to say when we pay the best in the state at the top level of Unit C, we are less competitive and had a strategic priority coming into this negotiation to be more competitive at the entry level of Unit C. So that fixed dollar will be a higher percentage to entry level, which would be a lower denominator, and a lower percentage to where we're the high level, we're already super competitive. So those $500 in year 3 and year 4 represent $500 per 1.0 FTE of a fixed dollar amount tacked on top of the 3%.
Okay.
Did I explain that? Okay.
I will watch the replay. Okay, yeah, it was helpful. No, it was helpful, but I do want to watch the replay. And I think earlier Mayor Fuller said that she's gonna has docketed the overlay surplus. I think you said 18 million, give or take. So that's coming in to the schools. Did I hear that correct?
I'll just try to recap one more time. We are docketed in NPS, Educational Stabilization Fund. It will be comprised of 3 things: $18.2 million from the overlay surplus, $800,000 of interest income that was earned on that 18.2 million in the last year, as well as $3 million of additional funding from free cash. That all adds up to $22 million. The city council will both first have to set up an NPS educational stabilization fund. That takes a two-thirds vote to have a stabilization fund. And then secondly, to move $22 million into it, that actually only requires a majority vote. And then in subsequent years, actually quite soon, the first time during the budget process, we'll come forward and say, we'd like to take a certain dollar figure out of that stabilization fund. The first year, it's roughly 3.9 million, but don't hold me to that, but approximately. And in subsequent years, you saw how Chair Bresky laid out the anticipated drawdown of those funds over the years ahead.
Okay, thank you. And just going back to the most important thing we took from today, student costs and needs are rising faster than our revenues. And that's with this $22 million operational, not stabilization fund. Did I say that right?
We'll see. I think I would have said we're fine for about 5 years.
Okay.
So we're all set. We're putting to good use one-time surplus funds. We are appropriately trying to look ahead and say, the other thing I just want to lift up, and the superintendent can speak for herself, she has endlessly fabulous, good ideas for how to improve even more. So the timing of the override is going to be very much, I think, tied to her vision and our willingness to support her vision to do more for our students, even if and when enrollments decline. We know we can serve our students better. And we've got a great leader who will help us realize that.
Thank you, Mayor Fuller. Is there any, Dr. Nolan, do you want to add something?
Can I just add one thing, Councilor Lucas? Sorry, before you go. So I want to be clear about the overlay funds and talking about that growth in student needs. If we think about how those overlay funds are being spent, they were meant to accomplish three things. One was to get those high school math and STEM classes down. Two was to provide incremental supports for our elementary schools, and that includes hiring 5 social workers. And 3 allowed us to increase our COLA offer made to the union on that date, and that's how we got to those 3% numbers for the first 3 years of the contract. But if you want to think about those things, so one is going towards, recognizing our teachers and giving a really competitive contract. One is to the high school classes, which have increased as a result of the cuts of the last couple years. So that's a little bit of backfilling almost. And then the third piece in hiring folks for those incremental supports, that's really the student growth piece. I can't promise you that, next year or the year after, we're not going to say, hey, look, you know what, the growth of our student needs is still beyond what we're able to fund under the current budget. I'm not making that promise to you tonight. I'm telling you that we believed, given the city's fiscal situation, this was a very reasonable path forward to put this plan in place of saying, think about approximately $4 million over the next 5 years. It accomplishes those 3 things over that time frame. It does not contemplate adding additional services in that time frame. And I'm pretty certain there's going to be an ask for additional services in that time frame.
Okay.
Councilor Luke,
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Nolan.
I just wanted to say, you hired me to take a look at your educational system and to make recommendations for the best school system possible for our Newton young people, and I'm going to continue to do that. That doesn't mean I can always back into and it's not a conflict between Ruth Ann and I. This is her doing her job and me doing my job, and we're doing that in front of you. And I'm going to tell you what I think the needs are going to be at all times. We are not alone, though. I want you to know that as president of the Tri-County Superintendents Association, we talk about this a lot. Local towns are experiencing these funding cliffs from federal and stimulus type monies that came through the pandemic funds. So neighboring towns, 10% increase in KP. Needham asked a 6.8% voted school committee budget increase from the prior year. Holliston in negotiations now. Walpole 5% increase. Hopkinton 5.35. Medfield 4.87. Medway 4.5. 8.8 in Canton. Millis 8.8. Lots of folks looking at layoffs during these time periods, and we are not in that situation. I will continue to forecast what I think the needs of the system are. I think we're bumping up against Proposition 2.5 and its constraints just the way the rest of Massachusetts is, and it's had a real stranglehold on Newton in these prior budgets.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to close on this. I did take a shallow dive, not a deep dive, of the enrollment projection report over the weekend, and I created this little table over the previous 3 enrollment projections. And yeah, it is not a good sign when I see these enrollment numbers drop. Looking at it right here, we're going to drop approximately 400 students in the next 5 years from NPS. And it's just, we are not hitting our enrollment projections based upon the prior enrollment projections. And it's a question that I think NPS is going to have to answer if you're going to need more money and approval from the voters for an increase in revenue. And that when they look at the enrollment is continuing to decline, but the costs are continuing to go up. And that's just something that I know a lot of people in the city do question and do wonder why the costs go up when the enrollment is continually to go down.
So, you're correct, and that's been certainly the experience. And, enrollment was trending down, and that was a lot of, macro factors and demographic factors that were causing that. And then we had a bit of a cliff during the pandemic as folks opted to go to schools that were open. Going back to in my answer to Councilor Gentile, enrollment over the past 5 years has dropped about 8%, and the number of our classroom teachers has dropped about 4%, which again is that sort of inefficiency of how that flows through the system. Of those classroom teachers that declined due to enrollment purposes, it was 100% and more made up for by the need to hire incremental special education teachers and to hire student aides. So staffing levels actually slightly increased, but there is no other line item that moved the needle one bit. Classroom teachers down, completely backfilled by special education and student aides. That is the reality of increased needs of students that did not exist 5 years ago, that exists today. That is the manifestation of that reality.
All set for the moment?
I am all set, but I think Dr.
I
Nolan
just
wants to
want
say
to
something.
say, if I may,
Sure, go ahead.
one of the reasons I'd like you to join us for the visits to the schools is I would like you to take a look at the breadth of programming that you provide here, which other systems do not do. And so headcount is one way to do things, but understanding the level of complexity and need is the system that I have to bring to you. I have to bring it to you so that you understand at a student level and a classroom level and a program level and a building level, because simply doing by headcount is what has us here. And it's one metric when you're looking at how to fund adequate programming. And if we're on the cheap in general education classroom services, we will backfill it with special education services. And that is something you are living right now.
So, Dr. Nolan, thank you. And colleagues, we had already committed to doing tours of both the city buildings and city departments and setting up school visits. And I think in addition to seeing The school buildings themselves certainly will coordinate with Dr. Nolan and Chair Bresky about doing some of the other more classroom-oriented type visits so that we all can collectively get a better understanding of what is going on day to day in our school buildings, which I think will help us a great deal in our understanding and in our decision making. So I have at least 4 more people. Councilor Wright, you're next, and then Councilor Leary. I shouldn't have said more people because that prompted more hands. Go ahead, Councilor Wright.
Thank you. I have a question on the financial aspect of it, but I'll take it offline. My second question was, it was being looked at possibly closing one of the elementary schools, Underwood or Ward, and that process was stopped after a couple of years review. I was wondering what happened, and is that going to be moving forward?
Yeah, so that, there was a working group pre-pandemic, that everything, pretty much got put on hold during the pandemic. There was an effort to reconstitute that last year, to start studying that again. And the committee came to a decision, which I wholeheartedly support, that we can't look at those 2 schools in isolation. We can't just say, hey, you know what, Ward and Underwood are both really old schools. They have accessibility issues. There's been some enrollment decline. Let's just look at those 2 things as if they didn't fit into a broader system, and that it didn't also impact how we as a system and as a community value the concept of having neighborhood schools. So we are undertaking a much broader review to look at this systematically across our entire elementary footprint, and what do we want that to look like. And there are going to be some natural trade-offs of things like people really value their neighborhood schools, and there is great benefits to them. However, they are inefficient. And they're inefficient both in terms of, aggregate staffing, but inefficient in terms of, you go through that process of, oh, you have an enrollment decline. Well, if you have 4 sections of a school, that might be more manageable than when you have 2 sections at a school. There is, actual, both academic, behavioral, et cetera, reasons why you want more than 1 or 2 sections per grade in a school. So that is a very big discussion that is about to occur over the coming months. And then that will inherently include Ward and Underwood and how we're going to manage that situation going forward. But it's going to be a broader think about what is this supposed to look like for, the coming generations.
Councilor Wright, did you want to follow up, or are you all set? All right, thank you. I have Councilor Leary and Councilor Lobovitz, please.
Well, Councilor Wright asked my question, of course.
Do you have another question, Councilor Leary?
I just want to, yeah, I do, but I also just wanted a little bit of follow-up on that because, Newton is known for its walkable local schools. They're really that's the lifeblood of our neighborhoods, and I would say particularly Underwood and Newton Corner is particularly important for the neighborhood there. I won't say it's my alma mater, and that's the reason I want to keep Underwood. But I've just been here. I had to say, when we got the email from you, Dr. Nolan, that you were putting an end to that working group, I was thinking, she's a keeper, because that was the right thing to do. But also thinking about, you'll need to bus students as well. There are other costs, of course, that come with closing schools. And I've always said to people, we know how to manage overcrowding. We're able to do that. We're able to move kids around. But when you close a neighborhood school, it's a crushing blow to the neighborhood. And I know, Dr. Nolan, you've had experience with that in your other role in Natick. But I just want to say I'd be very interested in being involved in that discussion, or, hear what's going on, and to work also with the parents and in those areas. But it's been something that's been weighing on me very heavily, and I think we need to think about that. Are we going to be committed to neighborhood schools, or is that in the past, we haven't been. The trend has been towards larger schools. But I want to still have, we'll discuss that further. My other question was in terms of other contracts that the city has, some of them very large, that are we thinking about? I assume we are thinking about those too. Bus contracts, for example, have gone up hugely. We have a trash contract coming up in 2027 that we think is going to be very expensive. We have other union contracts as well that we probably will be working with. It's just a lot of balls in the air. So I'm sure you're thinking about that, but that's sort of one of the things that I think about because, of course, on the city side, I always tell people if they want to complain about the streets and sidewalks, it's because we only get $9.5 million for 18 square miles of city streets. We do have that commitment to our schools, right? But Dr. Nolan, I do want to ask you, we're talking about how student needs have really grown and gotten much more complex. And I understand that. My kids were still in the schools during COVID. Do you expect that to continue, that level of service and needs and requirement, or do you think the kids will catch up at some point? Do you think you can think any change, like another 5 years from now, will we see kids coming back to a baseline that we saw before COVID?
So it depends what you mean by catch up, I think. I think you can always predict what your future is going to look like based on your preschool. And the preschool right now speaks predominantly another language other than English coming in. Many students, they're called SLIFE students, so students with limited formal education, are coming in and out of our high schools due to immigration, war, being transplanted from their home countries. Those numbers are up for everyone in Massachusetts. And so that's a new shade of complexity that 5 years ago wasn't there, added on top of learning loss due to the pandemic for students. And I have to say that since we do not skill benchmark in a way that actually allows me to know where you were before the pandemic and where you are now, that it's hard for me to answer that question. What I can tell you is we're starting to build the system that will allow us to track those types of improvements or lack of improvement, and that's what you want out of your school system. You want to know what's the return on investment that we're making, and is it working? And so I'm trying to build that background system. It's not going to happen in 1 year, right? So I need a little running room on that. What I will say to you, though, is that the complexity of programming that you provide in the Newton schools so that your students do not get outsourced to out-of-district placements is incredible and rich. And so the level of complexity here, by design, is greater than other school systems. But that also is protective for you. So for example, if the school system decided to become a school choice district, you have a buffer against other harms that other districts don't. So you can service a much broader range of students, you can keep them in their home schools, and you can serve more intensive needs of students. So I think that we're situated to address that complexity well. We just don't want to pull back on letting those programs really do their job. And when you've been in this sort of cut mode, you run the risk of degrading those services.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Well said, Councilor Leary.
With your permission, Mr. President, I'll just add on with the Health and Human Services Department embedded over in the city with the school nurses, but also our mental health, social services folks. I'm in now year 7 as mayor. We pre-pandemic, certainly pandemic, and now coming out of the pandemic, we are seeing whether it is with elementary school kids, secondary school kids, young adults in, I'll call it the 18 to 28-year-old group, seniors, we are seeing the degree of depression, anxiety, mental health issues expanding. And when I talk to somebody like our commissioner, we don't think this is a temporary blip. We are thinking that this is something that we need to be prepared as a city, and I would say as a school system, certainly for the next 10 years. I don't see this. Learning loss might be attenuated, but I think our society has changed, our social media use has changed, the way we connect with people has changed, and civil discourse has changed. Things have changed in a way that I think is degrading our mental health in a very real way.
Thank you, Mayor Fuller. Councilor Lobovitz.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to switch the discussion a little bit. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, about 20% of the Newton population residents are parents. Is that about right? Or roughly, yeah. So 80% are not. And if we are to ask more of our residents, we have to be very convincing to that 80% that the schools not only need more money because, as the mayor just articulated and others, the needs are great, but people could say the needs are insatiable. They might get to that point. So I would ask, how are we going to measure our success? We're going to put in millions of dollars into the system, and people are going to want to know, how did we do with all that money with a new superintendent? So what are the measures? I mean, you mentioned a fairly simple one, which is lower class size, but there must be many others, and I think now I'll just comment, I think it's important that we articulate the measures of success. I think that we measure those measures of success, we follow through on measuring, and we track those over time. Because I think that will be the other part of this, and maybe the more powerful part, if we're asking our citizens to pay more. So no need to answer that, but I would appreciate an articulation of that at some point in the near future. I think we all might appreciate that. Thank you.
Dr. Nolan, if you would, go ahead, please.
You're certainly not going to hear any disagreement from me. And you're looking at my board here. I believe that I was hired because that is how I operate. You can look at the prior annual performance reports and return on investment reports that I submitted to Natick taxpayers every year. So what did you pay for last year, town meeting, and what did you get for it this year? So you're going to hear that. You'll see the first section of our budget book will be a demo of the future annual report. So I'd welcome your feedback if there are things you want to see. What gets measured gets done. That said, we're not building widgets, so we have to be careful not to over measure the development of young people, but we can do it. And we're doing that in terms of mental health interventions. We need to do that for skill benchmarking in terms of reading, writing, and mathematics skills. And those are the data literacy pieces that I was talking to you about that we need all our staff to be tracking on that so that when we all track on it together, we get better results.
Thank you. I just had one other additional comment, which is the parents. So in that measurement, are you asking parents what they think about how their children are being educated? Because in the end, they are the consumers, and if we can't, if they're not convinced that we're doing better, we have a much bigger uphill battle.
That is the intention, a yearly community and culture survey that would allow us to take a baseline. I don't know where we'll land, but there's a lot of options. We're looking at that. I did some extensive survey work that's included in the entry plan which you can read about parents and the themes that they identified as issues in need of attention.
Thank you. Next, I have Counselor Krinsman, then Maliki, then Mickley. I don't have anybody else after that. We probably have room for one or two more folks. If they've asked questions, they're ready to ask another one if they want. Go ahead, please, Counselor Krinsman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to echo the folks who expressed their appreciation. I want to thank you all for both the things you did over the past few weeks, but also your continued service to the city, your care of the schools, and the work and the time that you put in. Thank you. I want to go back to the high school math situation a little bit because I've heard a growing number of complaints of math in the high schools that has to do with the ability of our students' preparation for assessments, complaints of specific teachers in many instances, and also I've seen more and more individuals having to hire math tutors. I also have in the back of my mind the experience coming out of COVID or during COVID where into the year, the schools were desperately trying to hire staff, putting out messages to the community. How do we find people? Because as Dr. Nolan, I think you articulated earlier, once the year starts, it gets so hard to attract people. My question is, I haven't looked in a couple of years, but I'm wondering about our retention numbers and our ability to retain the quality teachers that we value so highly. I'm also wondering if you all have any concerns, especially in light of the new contract. If you have any concerns with both our ability to attract new teachers, in particular new math teachers, before the next school year, and whether the most important thing there would be the compensation package, whether it has to do with the class sizes and the situation that they know they're walking into. Are there things that are going to hurt our ability to attract the teachers again over the summer? Or does it have more to do with the timing of the vacancies?
So as I wrote about in my entry plan, I don't think the problem is retention. The problem is churn within the organization. So there's been a lot of, I'll just say, misinformation about how many open positions there are in Newton Public Schools. So we list 80 positions on our human resources site, which are high frequency, hard to hire positions within any district. Special education teachers, psychologists, math and physics teachers, high school chemistry. These are things that are just hard to hire. And any district I've ever worked in, that's the case. Our new HR director and I share the same idea that we should be hiring and recruiting all year long. And so those positions are open, as well as an open resume repository for any bright star to put their business in there and get an interview from us anytime. Right now, there are only 12 open positions in the Newton schools out of 2,100. And most of those are anticipated leaves. 8 of them are paraprofessional or aide leaves, and 4 of them are anticipated teacher maternity leaves for the year. That's a darn good number. But here's what happens in our schools a lot, which is, let's say Liam and I both teach in the same elementary school. I go on leave, I'm a 4th grade teacher, he's a kindergarten teacher. Liam says, you know what, I've always wanted to teach 4th grade. I'm gonna go for that job this year and leave my K class mid-year. Hence, 2 classes are affected by a vacancy and a change and a churn. And that happens a lot, which means that our principals value our staff and want to put them in whatever seats they want, but it creates a churn and a training situation and a hiring situation where we're actually impacting more children with those changes. So that was the more surprising data. Our retention data is about 89% retention rate. It's one of the highest that we could find on the DESE website, and you can check that number yourself. So that's a number from the Department of Ed collects every year. It is historically high here. We have created an exit interview for anybody who's leaving us so we can actually create better thematic data on this. We also created a chatbot, AI-driven interview for staff to find out sort of how's it going here. We have not deployed it because we've been in a work to rule situation and then our recent strike. Not a great time to be asking people like, so how's it going? So we want to do that though, and we want to collect that exit data to see, what are those things that are driving people out.
Very, very quickly, if I may, Councilor Krinsman, It's, I believe, page 25 or 26 in the slide deck for tonight's materials. It does have a comparison of our retention rate of 88.4% to the peer districts as selected by the NTA, which I would argue are not truly our peer districts. For instance, they include 2 regional high schools, Concord, Carlisle, and Lincoln Sudbury. So you're comparing a high school effectively to a K-12 system of 12,000 students. But in that peer group, which is, you know, the highest performing districts in the state, the peer average is 87.5%, and the range is 85.5 to 93.3. I do recall Wayland was 93.3, which was like a total outlier year for them and for everyone. Like, I don't think there was anybody else above 90%. So even of that peer group, we were right at the top.
No, sorry, I have one and a half more. I want just to follow up and then one more quick question, sorry. Yes, I had seen those numbers, and my belief is that we have very high retention and a very high ability to retain, especially the quality of teacher that we want to retain. I was more specifically asking within the high school math context, are those numbers equally high? Are they high, again, for the people that we want to keep? We don't necessarily want to have a high retention rate for the folks who aren't cutting it, but are we able to keep the ones we want and recruit the ones who we need? So that's fine. Again, you don't need to give me those statistics now, but just within that context, especially understanding that class size may factor into this if we're sort of pouring our efforts in and really paying attention to the high school math department. That's one area that I'd love to just sort of hear about and make sure we're doing everything we can. The second question is there an achievement gap between the high schools?
I would not say there's an achievement gap between the high schools. I can't answer that question for you because the 2 high schools run vastly different sets of curricular units, and they do testing differently, and they track their successes differently. This is the system of schools versus the school system part that I told you. Now, no one's teaching like dinosaurs when they should be teaching calculus, but there's a wide variance as to what is happening, and there are no common assessments from both schools where I can say, this is where we're comparing student data. Just not even that it's a competition between the 2 high schools, but we should be able in the district to say, like, this is the course, what are the outcomes, how did we all do? And teachers should have time together, and they call them their grade level teams, GLDs, to say, well, you got great results, Liam. Why is that? What can I learn from you pedagogically in terms of classroom systems and all of those pieces? I'm not seeing that comparison being able to be conducted within teacher teams because we don't have reliable materials and expected common assessments.
Okay, I had heard something along those lines, and my hope would be that if there is a disparity between the 2, that we do our best to bring whichever one is sort of not achieving less, but, you know, isn't as profound, right? Isn't as rigorous as the other one, that we'd be bringing them both up to the higher of the 2 in whichever area.
You'll be happy to know that an internal curriculum review is desired by both departments to seek that alignment and unity and to try to find that common ground. So that's our plan for the coming year.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much. All set.
Thank you, Dr. Nolan. 3 more questions, and that's going to get us, I think, to 9 o'clock. Counselor Maliki, Counselor Mickley, Counselor Baker.
Thank you. And this might be a sort of short question and long answer that I don't really expect you to answer tonight. But in the course of all the letters we were getting and some of the forums we attended, we heard a lot about the problems of not having enough aides to cover required IAPs in grade school. And I don't know if that's so much a problem in the high school, but in the high school about if a teacher's absent, there's just no class. And I was wondering if, you know, not tonight necessarily, but if there's a way to quantify that. Are you keeping data on kind of how much we're short on coverage of types of classes, how much we're short on having anyone cover a class or cover a student on IAP, and versus how much on not having the right person. Like, I know it's one level of disruption to have a substitute teacher come in, and I don't know how it is these days, but it used to be kind of, a substitute, we can get away with anything. Versus like in high school, if, the math teacher is absent and you just don't have math class that day. And I always felt at a disadvantage the last month or two, not having kids or ever had kids in the Newton school system. So I don't have, my grade schooler coming in and saying, oh, this happened today because so-and-so wasn't there, or my high school teacher or student, if they would admit it, saying, didn't have this class today because we didn't have a teacher. So is there a way do you have data on how big a problem that is and what it will take to remedy that?
So this is a several-part question. So first, I'm happy to say to you that one of the working groups with our teachers union is to explore this issue of the behavioral therapist absenteeism and whether there are qualified substitutes for their particular roles. So those are the BTs that you heard about. So I think that's a unique and more complex thing about Newton that the case has been made to me as well, that we need a different solution there. So there's a working group that requires us to figure that out. So I want to say that. But the second part I want to say is there is an absentee problem among our workforce. And, I'm not going to be popular for saying that, but 12% of our paraprofessionals are out every day, and 6% of our Unit A teachers are out every day. And so that was billed as a substitute and a hiring problem. There's no way we can have 239 substitutes every day. There's no system that can scale that anywhere. And that's a lot of absenteeism. So then you have to ask, are there morale issues? Is it high class sizes? Is it the complexity of the work? What is it exactly, right? So we have to get our hands around those issues. But we definitely have an absentee problem. And, it's one part fixing whatever it is that's making staff out so much, and also tracking how much absenteeism there is. Principals are largely not tracking who's out all the time and those types of things. And there was an inordinate amount of sick bank use to supplement teacher absences, and these are things we addressed through the collective bargaining process in the most recent contract. So I think it's a whole bunch of things, and like a snowball, we have to sort of pack it together and get to the real solution. I think all the parts will help. We are canceling 30 classes a day at each high school, and that is a problem. And that is what parents tell me is a problem, kids are telling me is a problem. I don't know, that plus high class sizes in math, I know why AP scores are going down. And so we do have to address that as a collective. It's not to place blame anywhere, but that's a very unusual scenario to have that many classes a day canceled.
All set, Councilor Maliki. Councilor Mickley, then Councilor Baker, you get to wrap it up. Go ahead, Councilor Mickley.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, just want to thank everyone at Senator Court, Dr. Nolan, and all the elected leaders for all you do for our schools, all you've done for our schools and our students. I know it's been hard over the past weeks, and we're grateful for all your service. My question relates to reading Dr. Nolan's entry plan, which I thought was incredible, insightful, and highlighted so many of the issues that we heard and learned about as a community over the past few weeks. And in particular, there was one point highlighting, I'll just quote it, the decades-long practice of contentious negotiations and problem solving relative to compensation and benefits, and the lack of trust between parties, school committee, mayor, school leaders, NTA, and city council gets in the way of a vision around which all parties are centered to support students. I think this is the question that we're all struggling with. What do we do now? What's our role? We as a city council have a working group to address this. Councilor Oliver is chairing it. But specifically, this is one question. What I really like about you pointing this out also is it sort of highlights what Chair Bresky said at the beginning of the strike, that this really was a collective failure, that we all have responsibility for getting to this place. And also what Chair Bresky said at the end of the strike, that now it's our collective responsibility to ensure this never happens again. So my question is to three people, to Dr. Nolan, to Chair Bresky, and to Mayor Fuller, what can us as a city council do to ensure this never happens again, both as an institution and as individuals with relationships to our constituents our neighborhoods and our wards.
Well, this is sort of the topic of conversation among our staff, period. We have to build the competencies of trust within the community. What does high trust behavior look like? What does it look like as colleagues, as citizens, modeling it for our students? I have to say to you that I will always stand up on behalf of our teachers. Even though there was all this disagreement and there was all of this strife, everyone thought they were doing the right thing, and we could not communicate in a trusting environment in an effective way. We have no choice but to do that now, and we have to train around what are those behaviors, almost as if we're new to it. Let's learn about high trust behaviors. Let's train around it, and let's have the kind of restorative circles across the city that would allow us to clear the air over the pandemic, over the conflicts in the Middle East that are racking the city, and over this strike. If we don't execute some restorative practice and process across the city, we're going to be right back here at the next time that we do this. So it means meeting, it means coming together, it means having the hard conversations, it means being okay to disagree with each other, get it out there, and then connect on behalf of young people so that we're not saying we're going to agree all the time. Ruth Ann and I don't expect to agree all the time, but we sure are going to model how to do the kinds of collaborative work that the city needs to see and that we need to model for everybody to follow. We cannot stay entrenched in positions because the children will suffer. We just saw it. So my recommendation is that we use the expertise within the city, and I'm so grateful that you put together a committee to do this. We need to get aligned on what is the framework for restoration that we're going to use, and let's use it everywhere, and let's get into every neighborhood and every village, and let's practice it together. And we have to. There's no choice.
So, from my perspective, as it relates to the school committee, it does revolve around that same issue of trust, in the sense that, I know NTA leadership would say that trust has been fractured for a decade. As a parent, I felt it was fractured during COVID when I didn't feel like people were doing what they needed to do for my kids. There's no question that, as I feel like we were starting to build some of that back over the last year or so, and thanks in part to Kathy Smith, when she was here as our interim superintendent, I think did a great job rebuilding some of that. It's the only way we're going to get there is through just an incredibly increased level of transparency. When folks see that there's nothing to hide, you're not hiding anything, it's all out there. Nights like tonight, we're going to do more to be out in the community, to be answering questions. We want, more what Councilor Lobovitz referred to of what are our goals? Put them out there at the beginning, and then at the end of the year, state very objectively, we did good here, we didn't do so well here. These are the things we need to work on. I don't feel we heard that from NPS. I know I didn't feel like I heard that from NPS as a parent, the years leading into the pandemic and certainly during the pandemic. So that just massively increased level of transparency, I think, is going to have to be one of the key elements of rebuilding that trust, both with parents, with the community, and with our teachers.
Can I just add one thing? I think it has to come with increased psychological safety too, though, because if you crucify school staff every time you don't get the exact return on investment that you expected to see in a world of making children and solving things like academic problems and mental health problems, every teacher will run from this district, and so will every administrator. So that's not to say don't hold us accountable, but understand that if the minute that you don't see the data that you want, you oust me or whoever else, you will never get that trust, right? So children do not develop on a linear timeline or time frame, but we're going to be real clear about what we need and how we're doing. And then we'll all have to have collective conversations about resources and accountability. But those are scary words for teachers who have not had that situation set before them. They're worried that, you're going to line up everyone and whoever gets the lowest test scores out, right? So that's not the kind of system we want to build either. So yes, it's transparency, but it's also building the psychological safety and mutual accountability to allow us to succeed and fail together. Without that, we won't get it.
Mayor Fuller, did you want to add something? And then I want to let Councilor Baker finish up.
In addition to what both the superintendent and the chair said, I think the trust and transparency are two key T's. I think it's beyond that, though, that there has been a loss in the community, and I reflect a lot about how I can do better on this, of listening with true open ears, open mind, open heart, and really hearing a different point of view with some empathy and some compassion, even if it is diametrically different from your core values. We have really lost that. And the idea that we can't hear our teachers and our teachers' union and really hear it is a failure. The idea that the divisiveness about zoning and housing, we lost it there too. So what the complexities over how do we really build an inclusive educational model and community filled with respect and the tensions are rife once you start scratching the surface on any of these. So there is true difference of opinion here, but we're talking past each other constantly and we're following into our pet phrases and labeling people, and we have serious work to do to be able to neighbor, school parent to school parent, and to do that systemically. I would say that all of us, I know the superintendent is taking it seriously, the school committee is, the city council. I certainly am from my office. There have been so many people who, whether it's neighborhood groups or faith organizations or stakeholder groups, who are desperately seeking this out because there's a huge belief in Newton and Newtonians, in our schools, in our community, and our desire to be a place in this world that can do this better. It's going to take it is a collective failure, will take a collective effort, and we're all going to have to work hard individually. I think I do. I think there's a ton of self-reflection I'm doing, and that almost everybody I bump into is underway. So I look forward to, and by the way, it's not going to be an answer. It's going to be a series of answers, and it's not going to be done by the spring. This is real work.
Thank you, Mayor Fuller. Last, we have Councilor Baker.
Well, I just want to say how grateful I am to all of you for taking the time to come in and explain and explore as you have. I just have a couple of quick things, I hope. One is that the issue of the mental health crisis, I'm doing some work in my law school on this subject, so at some point I'm glad to sort of touch base because I can learn something from you all and maybe have a few things to, I hope, contribute. But I think that you spoke of a difference between a system of schools and a school system. I think that one of the things, to respond to my colleague's question earlier, which is that I think coming out of this, I hear an opportunity really to make the case again for why public education matters. If there's anything that I think may distinguish a common feature of America over the years, is a sense that public education was vital to the success of the Republic. And somehow I think we need to make that case again, because too many people are sort of saying, well, I'll just get mine and I'll sort of buy my way out. And I think that we all have a much bigger stake than we really understand in the quality of education, not only just in Newton, but all over the country, but certainly here to demonstrate why this matters. And Newton educators started in many years ago to do this with Horace Mann, and I think that that conversation can continue, so I just encourage you all along those lines.
So I'm not sure that requires any response, Councilor Baker, because that's a wonderfully aspirational model that I think we all should strive for. So it is 9 o'clock or 9:02. I apologize for being delayed. We are going to adjourn. I do want to remind everyone here, and more importantly, those who may be watching us, we have appointed a working group of the City Council. It consists of 5 members, chaired by Councilor Oliver. He has already reached out to the school superintendent and the school committee chair. We'll be reaching out to the mayor. I believe he's done that as well. This is going to be a collaborative effort, but within a month, we are going to have some specific recommendations that this council can adopt as to how we can try to move forward. And I'm very much looking forward to the effort of that working group. I want to thank them all publicly in advance for their work, and I think this is going to be very constructive. And I think as a council, I'm just going to add something. I was incredibly proud of how this council handled the school strike situation. I think we came together. I think we spoke virtually as one. I like to think we are quite supportive of our school committee, our school superintendent, the administration, and understanding at the same time the legitimate concerns and needs of our teachers. So I'm going to just offer a thank you to my colleagues for what I really thought was an extraordinary effort on our behalf and the city's behalf. So thank you. Looking forward to what Councilor Oliver's working group produces. And this will be the first of, I hope, regular meetings between the school committee, the school superintendent, and the city council. I think this has been extraordinarily informative for us. And we look very much forward to doing this more often and more frequently. So thank you. We are adjourned, and have a wonderful evening.